The setting sun painted Whiskey Creek's jagged cliffs in shades of crimson and gold, the light catching the water droplets from Tom Blackwood's gold pan like scattered diamonds. His weathered hands moved with a precision that spoke of years of practice, though anyone watching might have noticed those same hands bore calluses more consistent with gripping a pistol than mining tools. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 45, Tom had the lean, hard look of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors, though there was something in his ice-blue eyes that suggested more dangerous pursuits than mere prospecting. His claim, nestled in a remote corner of the Sierra Nevada mountains, had produced enough gold over the past 2 years to keep most men satisfied. But satisfaction wasn't what had driven Tom Blackwood to this lonely stretch of wilderness. The late summer of 1876 had brought more than just fortune seekers to this part of California. Rumors of rich strikes in the high country had drawn a darker element, men who preferred stealing gold to mining it. 3 claims had been jumped in the past month alone, their owners either run off or never seen again. The local sheriff, overwhelmed and underfunded, had done little more than file reports. Tom's claim sat apart from the others, tucked into a narrow valley that most prospectors had overlooked. His cabin, unlike the hasty shelters thrown up by other miners, was built with the careful attention of a man who understood defensive positions. The thick walls contained gun ports disguised as ventilation holes, and the location offered clear views of both approaches along the creek. "Evening, Mr. Blackwood." Young Jimmy Chen, son of the Chinese merchant who ran the general store in nearby Trinity Falls, appeared around the bend leading his mule. The boy made regular deliveries to the more remote claims, carrying supplies and news in exchange for small nuggets or gold dust. "Pa sent the coffee and ammunition you ordered." Tom straightened, his movements deliberately slow and stiff, like a man feeling the aches of age and hard labor. It was an act he'd perfected over the past 2 years, part of a carefully constructed identity. "Much obliged, Jimmy. How are things in town?" The boy's usually cheerful face darkened. "Not good, sir. Dawson's claim got jumped yesterday. Him and his boy barely got out with their lives. That makes 4 now." Tom nodded slowly, though his mind was already cataloguing details with the sharp precision that had once made him the most feared investigator in the Pinkerton Detective Agency's Western Division. "These claim jumpers, does anyone get a good look at them?" Mr. Dawson said there were 6 of them, led by a big fellow with a silver-plated Winchester. Called himself Marcus Hayes. Jimmy lowered his voice. "Word is, they used to ride with the Curry Gang before the law got too hot in Nevada." Tom's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those pale eyes. The Curry Gang had been his last case before he'd walked away from the Pinkertons, a bloody affair that had left him with 3 bullet scars and a deep weariness for the violence that had defined his life. He'd chosen this remote claim specifically to leave that world behind. "Best be getting back before dark, Jimmy," Tom said, pressing a small gold nugget into the boy's hand. "Creek's running high with the last rain. Trail gets treacherous after sunset." As Jimmy disappeared around the bend, Tom moved with a speed and grace that belied his earlier performance. Inside his cabin, beneath the rough plank floor, lay a hidden compartment containing the tools of his former trade. A matched pair of Remington revolvers, a Pinkerton badge he'd never officially surrendered, and a leather-bound journal filled with names, dates, and the kind of details that had helped him track some of the West's most dangerous outlaws. Tom had spent 15 years as Alan Pinkerton's most effective agent, earning a reputation for ruthless efficiency that made hardened criminals fear the mere mention of his name. His methods hadn't always aligned with official law enforcement, but they'd produced results. The same strategic mind that had brought down train robbers and murderers had served him well as a prospector, helping him identify promising claims that others missed. The sound of approaching horses drew his attention. Through carefully positioned mirrors, another trick from his Pinkerton days, Tom observed 3 riders moving slowly along the creek. Their manner suggested casual interest, but he noted the way they studied the terrain, how their hands stayed close to their weapons. Scouts, most likely, assessing his claim's defenses. Tom allowed himself a grim smile as he began his preparations. He'd chosen this location carefully, spending months developing contingency plans for exactly this situation. The claim jumpers would come, probably within the next few days. They'd expect to find a solitary prospector, perhaps a bit more organized than most, but still an easy target. What they'd discover instead was a man who'd spent his life understanding how criminals thought, who could anticipate their moves because he'd spent years tracking men exactly like them. The peaceful prospector was a role Tom had played convincingly, but beneath that facade lay the strategic mind that had made him a legend in the Pinkerton agency. As night settled over Whiskey Creek, Tom Blackwood reviewed his defenses with the same methodical attention he'd once given to planning operations against some of the West's most notorious gangs. The claim jumpers would come expecting an easy target. They'd learned too late that they'd stumbled onto the claim of a man who'd made his real fortune not in gold, but in bringing men like them to justice. In his hidden basement room, Tom opened his journal, adding notes about the scouts he'd observed. Every detail mattered. The way they rode, the weapons they carried, their apparent level of professional experience. These weren't ordinary claim jumpers. Their movements showed military-style training. The reference to Marcus Hayes and the Curry Gang suggested something bigger than simple robbery. The lamplight caught the silver star of his Pinkerton badge, still gleaming after 2 years in hiding. Tom had walked away from that life-seeking peace, but peace, it seemed, had other plans. As he checked his Remingtons with practiced hands, Tom reflected that some skills, once learned, never truly fade. The claim jumpers were about to discover. The gold wasn't the only thing of value buried in these mountains. Sometimes the most dangerous treasures were the secrets men tried to leave behind. The flickering lamplight cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls as Tom pulled out an old tintype photograph from his journal. It showed a younger version of himself, standing alongside Alan Pinkerton and a group of agents after the infamous Carson City Railroad heist. 7 men had died that day, including 2 of Tom's fellow agents. The memory still haunted him, though not as much as what came after. A sound from outside caught his attention, the soft crunch of boots on gravel, too deliberate to be casual. Through his mirror system, Tom spotted a lone figure moving carefully along the creek bed. Most would have mistaken it for a prospector returning late from his claim, but Tom recognized the practiced movement of a professional scout. The man was mapping approaches to the cabin, likely planning for a night raid. Tom moved silently to one of his concealed observation ports, mentally noting how the scout favored his left side. An old injury, perhaps, and potentially useful information. In his Pinkerton days, such details had often meant the difference between life and death. He'd learned early that survival depended not just on being faster or stronger, but on knowing your opponent better than they knew themselves. The scout passed close enough for Tom to catch a glimpse of a distinctive scar running along his jaw, a detail that triggered his memory. He'd seen that scar before, in a wanted poster from his agency days. The man was Joel McPherson, a former cavalry sergeant turned hired gun. His presence confirmed Tom's suspicions that these weren't ordinary claim jumpers. McPherson had a reputation for working only with disciplined crews on well-planned operations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the scout disappeared into the gathering darkness, Tom retrieved another item from his hidden cache, a detailed map of the surrounding territory that he'd carefully annotated over the past 2 years. Every cave, every hidden trail, every potential ambush point had been meticulously documented. It wasn't just gold he'd been prospecting for, he'd been preparing for the day when his past might catch up with him. In town, he maintained the persona of Thomas Blackwood, the quiet prospector, who kept to himself. Few would have connected him to Thomas Hawkeye Blake, the Pinkerton agent whose name had struck fear into outlaw gangs across the Western Territories. His reputation had been built not on gun-fighting prowess, though he was skilled enough with his Remingtons, but on his uncanny ability to predict and counter criminal operations before they occurred. A distant owl call drew his attention. Not quite natural, a signal being passed between scouts. Tom smiled grimly as he began making subtle adjustments to his defenses. He'd positioned thin tripwires across likely approach routes, attached to small bells carefully hidden in the undergrowth. Other surprises waited as well: false trails leading to dead ends, carefully weakened tree limbs that could be dropped to block retreat routes, and caches of weapons and supplies hidden at strategic points throughout his claim. The night air carried the scent of pine and sage mixed with the earthy smell of the creek. Tom checked his pocket watch, nearly midnight. In his experience, raids typically came in the pre-dawn hours when sleep was deepest. The claim jumpers would likely make their move just before sunrise, expecting to find him unprepared. They'd soon learn that some habits die hard. In his Pinkerton days, Tom had made a practice of sleeping only in short bursts, always alert for the smallest sign of danger. That vigilance had saved his life more times than he could count, especially during the 3 years he'd spent undercover infiltrating the Wallace gang in Montana. The memory of that operation brought a familiar tightness to his chest. He'd spent so long playing the role of an outlaw that coming back had been difficult. Sometimes he still wondered if that experience had influenced his decision to become a prospector. Another role to play, another identity to hide behind. Near his bed lay a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, its margins filled with his own careful notes. The ancient philosopher's words about duty and purpose had helped him through dark times, especially after the bloody end of the Curry Gang case. He'd tried to leave that violence behind, to find peace in the solitary life of a prospector. But, as he made his final preparations for the night ahead, Tom acknowledged a truth he'd long denied. Part of him had been waiting for this, for a chance to use his skills one more time. The distant sound of a falling rock, too heavy to be natural, too isolated to be accidental, confirmed his assessment. The claim jumpers were positioning themselves for tomorrow's raid, probably setting up observation posts on the ridgelines. They would watch his claim through the night and into morning, learning his routines, looking for weaknesses. Tom allowed himself a small smile as he made a show of banking his fire for the night, playing the role of the unsuspecting prospector. Preparing for sleep, let them watch. Every move they made, every position they took, would tell him more about their plans and capabilities. By the time they made their move, he would know more about their operation than they did themselves. In the hidden basement room, Tom made final checks of his equipment. Beyond the Remingtons, he had accumulated an arsenal that would have impressed his old Pinkerton colleagues. A Henry rifle modified for accuracy, several Colt revolvers positioned at strategic points throughout the cabin, and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. But his real weapons had always been patience and preparation. The last item he checked was a small leather case containing a set of lockpicks and other tools of his former trade. Some skills were like riding a horse. Once learned, never forgotten. As he settled in for his first short rest of the night, Tom reflected that tomorrow would prove whether his time in the mountains had dulled his edge or merely honed it to a finer point. Dawn crept over the eastern ridges of Whiskey Creek as Tom Blackwood methodically worked his sluice box, though his attention remained fixed on the three riders approaching from the south. Their expensive horses and well-maintained weapons marked them as something other than ordinary prospectors. The leader, a tall man with a carefully trimmed mustache and a silver-mounted Winchester, reined up at the edge of Tom's claim. "Morning, friend," the man called out, his cultured voice carrying a hint of Virginia ancestry. "Marcus Hayes, understand you've got yourself quite a profitable operation here." Tom straightened slowly, maintaining his facade of a weather-beaten prospector. His mind, however, was cataloguing every detail about Hayes and his companions. The way they had positioned themselves, triangulated coverage of the area, clear lines of fire, spoke of military training. The shorter man to Hayes's left had the distinctive bearing of cavalry, while the third rider's calloused trigger finger and steady gaze marked him as a professional gunman. "Does all right," Tom replied, deliberately thickening his accent. "Enough to keep me in coffee and bacon," Hayes smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Modest, but my sources suggest otherwise. Word is, you're pulling out enough color to interest the assay office in Sacramento." The implied threat hung in the air. Tom had indeed made several substantial gold shipments, though always carefully timed and routed to avoid attention. Someone in the assay office had clearly been bought, likely providing Hayes with information about successful claims in the region. "Don't believe everything you hear," Tom said, casually resting his hand on the worn handle of his mining pick. To most observers, it would have seemed a natural gesture. In reality, the pick's handle concealed a carefully balanced throwing knife, another holdover from his Pinkerton days. Hayes gestured expansively at the surrounding hills. "Beautiful country. Shame how dangerous it's become lately. Claim jumping, robberies. A man needs friends out here. Protection. I manage." "Of course you do," Hayes agreed smoothly. "But times are changing. The days of the lone prospector are ending. Smart men are consolidating, pooling their resources. My associates and I are offering partnerships to select claims in the area." Tom recognized the scheme from his investigative days. Hayes' group would offer protection in exchange for a controlling interest in profitable claims. Those who refused would face escalating pressure until they either sold out or met with unfortunate accidents. "Appreciate the offer," Tom replied, noting how Hayes's right-hand man had subtly shifted his horse to gain a better angle. "But I prefer working alone." "Give it some thought," Hayes suggested, though his tone carried steel beneath the courtesy. "We'll be back in a few days to discuss terms. Times being what they are, I would hate to see anything happen to such a promising operation." As the riders departed, Tom allowed himself a grim smile. Hayes had revealed more than he'd intended. The reference to associates and the professional quality of his men suggested backing from larger interests. In Tom's experience, such organized operations usually had connections to mining companies or railroad consortiums looking to acquire land through less than legal means. Inside his cabin, Tom retrieved his journal, adding detailed descriptions of Hayes and his men. The violent deaths of Marshal Cooper and his entire family 3 months ago in Nevada territory had carried similar hallmarks: claims of protection followed by systematic intimidation. Tom had been tracking such incidents even in his self-imposed retirement, noting patterns that pointed to an organized campaign of claim jumping across multiple territories. A knock at his door interrupted his writing. "Mr. Blackwood, it's Sarah Chen from the general store." Tom quickly secured his journal before opening the door to find Jimmy Chen's older sister, her usually cheerful face drawn with worry. At 25, Sarah ran the store's books with remarkable efficiency, helping her father manage the growing business that served as Trinity Falls' commercial hub. "Pa sent me," she said without preamble. "You need to know. Hayes' men were asking questions in town, about you specifically. They offered gold for information about your shipments and habits. Tom nodded unsurprised. Your father's response? Told them nothing, of course. The Chen family remembers who helped us keep our store when the town council tried to force us out last year. She hesitated, but others talked. The assay office clerk, Jenkins, he's been flashing silver dollars around the saloon. This confirmed Tom's suspicion about the information leak. Thank you, Sarah. Best head back now. Stay alert on the trail. After she left, Tom began implementing contingency plans he'd developed months ago. The hidden room beneath his cabin contained not just weapons, but detailed maps and documents. He'd learned during his Pinkerton years that information was often more valuable than gold. Every major claim-jumping operation he'd investigated had links to legitimate businesses, banks, mining companies, railroads. Men like Hayes were merely the visible face of larger conspiracies. Through his mirror system, Tom spotted movement on the ridge above his claim. Hayes had left observers behind. Good. Let them watch him play the role of the nervous prospector preparing for trouble. They'd see him moving supplies, reinforcing his cabin's defenses in obvious ways that would draw attention from his more subtle preparations. By late afternoon, Tom had positioned several false caches of gold dust where they might be discovered. By searching eyes, his real storage spots, carefully hidden and rigged with alarms, remained secure. The rest of his gold had already been moved through a series of dead drops to safety, another technique from his agency days. The sound of gunfire in the distance drew his attention. Through his spyglass, Tom observed smoke rising from the direction of old Pete Wilson's claim. The old-timer had refused to sell out last week, according to Jimmy's gossip. Tom's jaw tightened as he watched Hayes' men ride away from the burning cabin. No sign of Wilson himself. This changed the timeline. Hayes was escalating faster than expected, likely under pressure from his backers to secure the richest claims quickly. Tom had hoped for more time to gather evidence about the operation's leadership, but circumstances were forcing his hand. A glint of light from the western ridge caught his attention, sunlight reflecting off glass. Someone was using a spyglass to observe the valley. Not Hayes's men. They were too professional for such a basic mistake. Tom adjusted his own glass, focusing on the position. The observer's outline was familiar. Marshal James McKenna from the Territorial Office. Tom had worked with him during the Curry Gang investigation, though McKenna had never learned his true identity as a Pinkerton agent. The Marshal's presence suggested the territory was finally taking notice of the claim-jumping epidemic. This is a complicated matter. Tom had planned to handle Hayes's operation quietly, using methods that wouldn't bear official scrutiny. The Marshal's involvement meant he'd need to be more careful, ensuring any evidence could stand up in court rather than simply eliminating the threat. As darkness approached, Tom made his final preparations for the night. Hayes' men would likely wait a few days before making their move, but professionals sometimes struck quickly, using their target's false sense of security against them. Through his carefully hidden observation points, he spotted at least 3 men taking up positions around his claim. The attack, when it came, was more subtle than he'd expected. Shortly after midnight, Tom detected the distinct odor of burning pine pitch, a common method for smoking out cabin dwellers. Hayes's men had started small fires upwind, likely hoping to drive him out into their guns. Tom smiled grimly as he donned the mining company surveyor's outfit he'd prepared for such occasions. In the chaos of smoke and fire, an escaping miner would draw immediate attention. A surveyor with official-looking papers riding confidently away from danger would barely warrant notice. He'd used similar tactics during his Pinkerton days, understanding that the best escape often involved becoming someone else entirely. As he led his horse through a hidden trail he'd prepared months ago, Tom reflected that Hayes' operation was about to learn the difference between jumping a simple gold claim and tangling with a man who'd spent his life outwitting far more dangerous adversaries. The fires would destroy enough surface evidence to make his claim appear abandoned, while preserving the underground room and its crucial documentation. By the time Hayes realized his target had slipped away, Tom would be implementing the next phase of his plan, turning from hunted to hunter. In his saddlebags, along with the surveyor's documentation and official-looking maps, was his Pinkerton journal containing every detail he'd gathered about the claim-jumping operation. Years of investigative experience had taught him to look beyond immediate threats to the money men behind them. Hayes was dangerous, but he was merely a tool. The real power lay elsewhere, in comfortable offices where respectable businessmen plotted to steal land through more sophisticated means than simple violence. Those men would soon learn that they'd made a serious miscalculation. They thought they were dealing with a solitary prospector. Instead, they'd attracted the attention of the man who had once been the Pinkerton agency's most ruthless investigator, the same strategic mind that had brought down the Wallace and Curry gangs was now focused on exposing and dismantling their entire operation. As Tom rode through the darkness, taking a circuitous route toward Trinity Falls, he heard a commotion from the direction of the Chinese Quarter. Muffled shouts and breaking glass carried on the night air. His instincts, honed through years of investigation, told him this was no ordinary disturbance. Tethering his horse in a sheltered grove, Tom moved silently through the shadows toward the source of the noise. The scene that greeted him confirmed his suspicions. 4 of Hayes' men were ransacking the Chen family's store, while old Mr. Chen and his daughter Sarah were being held at gunpoint by Joel McPherson himself. "One last time," McPherson was saying, his voice carrying the cold efficiency of a man used to intimidation. "Blackwood's shipment records. We know you keep copies of everything that moves through your store." Sarah Chen stood defiantly between the gunman and her father, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "And I told you, we don't keep such records. Mr. Blackwood is a private man." Tom's mind raced through options. Direct intervention would blow his carefully constructed cover and reveal capabilities that would raise unwanted questions. Yet the Chens had risked their safety to protect his secrets. He owed them more than tactical consideration. The solution came from his memories of a similar situation in Denver years ago. Moving quickly but quietly, Tom circled to the rear of the neighboring building. A few careful movements with his lockpicks gained him access to the second floor. From there, he used techniques learned during his Pinkerton days to create the impression of multiple approaching riders. Scattered pebbles, mimicked hoofbeats, and carefully thrown voices. Marshal's office. Buildings surrounded. The effect was immediate. Hayes' men, already nervous about operating so openly in town, scattered into the night. McPherson, more experienced, hesitated only briefly before following his companions. Professional that he was, he'd recognized the deception soon enough, but by then the moment would have passed. Tom waited until he was certain they were gone before slipping away himself. The incident revealed several crucial details about the operation. The fact that Hayes' men would risk such a brazen action in town suggested pressure from above. Their specific interest in shipping records indicated they were building detailed intelligence about the area's gold production. More importantly, Sarah Chen's quick thinking had protected not just his records, but evidence he'd carefully planted about other claims in the region. The store's ledgers contained carefully crafted misinformation that would lead Hayes' operation to waste time and resources investigating worthless claims while overlooking genuinely rich ones. Back on the trail to town, Tom reflected on how the night's events had accelerated his timetable. The attempt to intimidate the Chens showed increasing desperation from Hayes's backers. They needed to secure the richest claims quickly, likely to satisfy promises made to Eastern investors. His destination was the International Hotel, Trinity Falls' finest establishment. As a surveyor for the Western Mining Commission, he'd have legitimate reason to take rooms there while conducting his official business. More importantly, it would put him in proximity to the town's power brokers, men like Jacob Whitmore, who moved comfortably in both legitimate and shadowy enterprises. The hotel's night clerk barely glanced at his credentials, another sign of the territory's growing sophistication. 5 years ago, such documents would have faced much closer scrutiny. Now, with mining companies and railroad interests flooding the region with representatives, another surveyor was hardly worth noting. In his room, Tom laid out the components of his next identity with the same precision he'd once used to plan Pinkerton operations. The surveyor's role would open doors, but it was merely the first layer of his strategy. Each move had to build naturally upon the last, creating a web of evidence and influence that would ultimately expose not just Hayes's operation, but the corrupt power structure behind it. A soft tap at his window froze him momentarily, until he recognized Sarah Chen's distinctive signal, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slow ones. He'd established the code during his early days in Trinity Falls, though he'd hoped never to need it. "They'll be back," Sarah whispered once he'd let her in through the back stairs. "Not tonight, but soon. McPherson was too interested in those shipping records. And there's something else. I overheard them mention a name. Sullivan." Tom's expression didn't change, but internally, pieces clicked into place. Patrick Sullivan had been a major figure in his last Pinkerton case, a banker, with connections to both the Curry Gang and several prominent railroad companies. His involvement suggested this claim-jumping operation was part of something far larger than local greed. "You're not really a surveyor," Sarah said quietly. It wasn't a question. "No," Tom admitted. "But right now that's exactly what I need to be." The men behind Hayes, they're used to dealing with either honest citizens they can bully or criminals they can buy. They don't know how to handle someone who can move in both worlds. Sarah nodded, her quick mind grasping implications beyond her years. Like a man who can be both prospector and surveyor, both victim and hunter. "Your father's ledgers," Tom said, changing the subject. "The real ones, safe, hidden where you showed us, with the other documents you've been gathering." She smiled slightly. "Pa says you're either the most paranoid prospector he's ever met, or something much more interesting. Don't worry, Mr. Blackwood, or whatever your name really is. Your secrets are safe with us. The Chen family pays its debts." After she left, Tom added Sarah's information about Sullivan to his carefully encrypted journal. The pieces were coming together faster than he'd expected. Hayes's operation wasn't just about claiming rich gold deposits. It was about controlling entire territories through a combination of violence, legal maneuvering, and financial manipulation. Tomorrow, he'd begin the delicate work of infiltrating Trinity Falls' upper circles. Jacob Whitmore's weekly poker game attracted the town's most influential citizens. As a visiting mining commissioner, he'd have a natural entree to that exclusive gathering. And if his carefully crafted background document sparked the interest of men with connections to Patrick Sullivan, so much the better. Tom touched the hidden pocket containing his Pinkerton badge. He'd walked away from that life, but perhaps he'd never truly left it behind. Some men were built for peace, others for war. Tom Blackwood, or Thomas Hawkeye Blake, had finally accepted that he belonged to a rarer breed, those who fought not for glory or violence, but for justice, using whatever means necessary to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The International Hotel's private card room smelled of expensive cigars and old money. Tom Blackwood, now perfectly attired as mining commission surveyor Thomas Blake, studied his fellow players with the same attention he'd once given to wanted posters. Jacob Whitmore held court at the head of the green baize table, his carefully manicured hands shuffling cards with practiced precision. "Fascinating report about the new strikes up near Whiskey Creek," Whitmore commented, dealing the next hand. "Though I hear there's been some unfortunate business with claim jumpers. Even had one of my prospectors driven off his claim just yesterday, fellow named Blackwood." Tom arranged his cards carefully, noting how the banker's eyes flickered toward Judge Harrison Morton, the territory's senior judicial officer. The judge's slight nod was nearly imperceptible, but to Tom's trained eye it spoke volumes about the connections between Trinity Falls power brokers and Hayes's operation. "Terrible business," Tom replied, matching Whitmore's bet. "Though my surveys suggest the real value in that region lies elsewhere. The geological formations near Eagle Ridge show remarkable similarity to the Comstock patterns." The casual reference to Nevada's richest silver strike had its intended effect. Whitmore's interest sharpened, though he maintained his casual demeanor. "You don't say? I wasn't aware the Mining Commission was surveying that area." Special directive from the San Francisco office. Recent changes in territorial law have opened new opportunities for strategic development. The hand played out in thoughtful silence, each man considering implications beyond the cards. Tom lost a careful $50, enough to maintain his cover as a moderately successful bureaucrat, not so much as to seem careless with money. Throughout the evening, he wove careful references to his fictional surveys into the conversation, painting a picture of vast mineral wealth in areas away from his true interests. As the night progressed, Tom's careful groundwork bore fruit. Whitmore invited him to stay after the regular game concluded, ostensibly to discuss mining regulations. Judge Morton lingered as well, along with Franklin Pierce, the railroad's regional land agent. "Another bourbon, Mr. Blake?" Whitmore offered, producing a private bottle of Kentucky's finest. "I believe we share some common interests regarding the territory's development." Tom accepted the drink, noting how the other men had positioned themselves. Whitmore at his desk, Pierce near the door, the judge lounging in apparent casualness that left his right hand free. They were evaluating him, deciding whether to bring him into their confidence or eliminate a potential threat. "The Mining Commission," Whitmore continued, "has considerable influence over claim legitimacy. A man in your position could help ensure development proceeds smoothly, assuming," Judge Morton added quietly, "that man understands the broader picture." Tom took a careful sip of bourbon. This was the moment he'd been orchestrating since arriving in town. "Gentlemen, let's speak plainly. The territory's current claim system is chaotic, inefficient. Small operators lack the capital for proper development. What's needed is consolidation under proper management." Pierce nodded approvingly. "Exactly our thinking, though some prospectors are reluctant to embrace progress." "Progress requires persuasion," Tom agreed, "both legal and otherwise. I assume you have resources for handling local resistance?" The moment stretched as Whitmore studied him. Tom maintained his carefully crafted persona, the ambitious bureaucrat willing to be bought, but requiring a show of trust before committing himself. It was a role he'd perfected during his Pinkerton days, understanding that corrupted officials were often the key to exposing larger criminal enterprises. "We may," Whitmore finally said, "though recent events have complicated matters. This morning's incident with the Chinese merchant, for instance. Overzealous employees can sometimes act prematurely." Tom affected mild interest. "The Chen family. I passed their store earlier. Seemed to be some damage. Regrettable," the judge interjected, "though perhaps inevitable given their association with certain resistant elements." The conversation continued in carefully coded terms, each man revealing just enough to test the waters without fully committing themselves. Tom played his role perfectly, showing sufficient interest to encourage further confidence while maintaining enough reluctance to seem genuine. As he left the hotel an hour later, Tom's mind was already categorizing the evening's revelations. The conspiracy was larger than he'd initially suspected. Whitmore's operation wasn't just about claim jumping. It was about controlling the entire territory's mineral wealth through a combination of legal manipulation, financial pressure, and strategic violence. A shadow moved in the alley beside the hotel. Tom's hand moved casually toward his hidden derringer, then relaxed as he recognized Sarah Chen's distinctive silhouette. "My father found something," she whispered, falling into step beside him. Hidden in an old ledger from 3 years ago, records of payments from Whitmore's bank to a name you might recognize, Marcus Hayes. Before he started operating here? Yes, but that's not the interesting part. The payments were countersigned by Patrick Sullivan. Tom's stride didn't falter, but his mind raced with implications. Sullivan's involvement connected this operation directly to the bloodbath that had ended his Pinkerton career. The Curry Gang's last stand hadn't been about bank robbery at all. It had been about hiding evidence of Sullivan's larger conspiracy. In his room at the boarding house, carefully chosen over the hotel to maintain his surveyor's modest means, Tom extracted his Pinkerton journal from its hidden compartment. The coded entries from 3 years ago painted a pattern he hadn't fully recognized at the time. Sullivan using gang violence to mask systematic takeovers of mineral-rich territories, then legitimizing the acquisitions through banking and railroad connections. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, someone trying to move stealthily and nearly succeeding. Tom extinguished his lamp in one smooth motion, years of experience guiding him to a position beside the door. The handle turned slowly, carefully. The first man through the door went down silently, caught by Tom's precisely aimed strike to the throat. The second managed to clear his pistol before Tom's boot knife found his gun hand. The third, showing more wisdom, retreated down the hallway, firing blindly. Tom didn't pursue it. Instead, he quickly gathered his essential documents and slipped out the window onto the rooftop he'd already scouted for exactly this possibility. The attack confirmed his suspicions. Someone in Whitmore's organization had recognized him, perhaps from his Pinkerton days. Moving silently through the night-shrouded town, Tom considered his options. The failed assassination attempt would force Whitmore's group to accelerate their plans. They'd assume his surveyor identity was compromised, but they didn't know about his connection to the Blackwood claim. That gave him an advantage they wouldn't expect. A horse whinnied softly from the livery stable, his prearranged signal from Jimmy Chen. The boy had proved remarkably adept at gathering intelligence, his youth and race, making him practically invisible to the town's power brokers. "Marshal McKenna's back," Jimmy reported once Tom reached him. "Brought 2 deputies with him. They're asking questions about Hayes and the claim jumpings." This is a complicated matter. The marshal's presence meant official law enforcement was finally taking notice, but it also meant Tom would have to be more careful about his methods. Evidence that might convince a jury would require different handling than the type of proof he'd gathered as a Pinkerton. "Something else," Jimmy added. "Overheard Hayes's men talking at the saloon. Sullivan himself is coming, arriving on tomorrow's stage from Sacramento." Tom's pulse quickened. Sullivan's personal involvement suggested the operation was reaching a critical phase. The banker rarely showed himself unless success was certain or desperate measures were needed. "Keep watching," he instructed Jimmy. "But be careful. These men are getting nervous, and nervous men make mistakes." After the boy left, Tom made his way to another pre-prepared hiding spot, this one in an abandoned mine shaft outside town. Inside, he had stashed everything needed for his next move. weapons, disguises, and most importantly, documents that would prove vital in the coming days. Among the papers was a yellowed wanted poster, not for a criminal, but for him. Wanted, information regarding the whereabouts of Pinkerton agent Thomas Hawkeye Blake, presumed dead in the Carson City Railroad incident, 1873. The poster was Sullivan's work, an attempt to flush him out after he'd gone into hiding with evidence of the banker's crimes. Tom allowed himself a grim smile as he checked his weapons and reviewed his plans. Sullivan's arrival would change the game completely. The banker's presence would either validate Tom's patient gathering of evidence or force a more direct confrontation. Either way, events were building toward a resolution that had been 3 years in the making. In the distance, a whistle announced the approach of the midnight train from Sacramento. Tom's practiced ear noted that it was running ahead of schedule. Sullivan's influence at work, ensuring his arrival wouldn't match published timetables. The banker's paranoia had only grown since their last encounter. Tom checked his pocket watch, mentally calculating trajectories and timing. By now, Hayes's men would be searching Trinity Falls systematically, looking for the surveyor who had escaped. They're assassins. They wouldn't think to watch his supposedly abandoned claim up at Whiskey Creek. Sometimes the best hiding place was the one your enemies thought they'd already cleared. The night wind carried the scent of pine and sage, mixed with the metallic tang of approaching rain. A storm was building in the mountains, nature's own commentary on the gathering human tempest. Tom Blackwood, or Thomas Blake, or Hawkeye, or whatever name best served justice, prepared himself for what was coming. The next few days would determine not just his fate, but the future of the entire territory. A soft whistle from the darkness caught Tom's attention, Sarah Chen's warning signal. He melted deeper into the shadows as 2 of Hayes's men passed nearby, their conversation carrying clearly in the night air. "Sullivan's bringing his own crew," one said. "Professional men from back east. None of this local talent." "About time," his companion replied. "Whitmore's been too soft, letting these miners think they have choices. Sullivan's got bigger plans." Tom waited until they passed before slipping toward the Chen store. Sarah met him at the back door, her face tight with worry. "There's more," she whispered. "Judge Morton's clerk was burning papers tonight. Land deeds, claim registrations. They're erasing the official records." This confirmed Tom's worst fears. Sullivan wasn't just coming to oversee the operation. He was preparing to rewrite the territory's legal history. Without proper documentation, legitimate claim holders would have no way to prove ownership. "My father found something else," Sarah continued, producing a tattered envelope. This was hidden in the store's foundation. "When we bought it, I think the previous owner left it for someone." Inside was a letter dated 1873, addressed to Hawkeye and signed by Alan Pinkerton himself. Tom's hands tightened on the paper as he read, "Blake, Sullivan's reach goes deeper than we suspected. The Carson City incident was no accident. He has judges, bankers, and railroad men in 3 territories under his control. What we thought was simple corruption is actually a systematic takeover of the entire Western mining industry. Be careful. Our own organization may be compromised. Trust no one. AP." The letter filled in crucial gaps in Tom's understanding. He'd always suspected the Carson City tragedy had been orchestrated, but this confirmed Sullivan's direct involvement. More importantly, it explained the banker's elaborate efforts to eliminate him. Tom hadn't just witnessed a crime, he'd stumbled onto evidence of a vast conspiracy. Sarah watched him with keen intelligence. The letter mentions Hawkeye. There are stories about a Pinkerton agent by that name who disappeared after bringing down the Curry gang. They say he was the best investigator the agency ever had. "Stories get exaggerated," Tom replied carefully. "Maybe. But Pa says you handle yourself more like a lawman than a prospector. And your interest in Hayes's operation seems personal." Before Tom could respond, the night exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from the direction of the telegraph office, followed by shouts and running feet. Through his carefully positioned mirrors, Tom spotted Marshal McKenna and his deputies exchanging shots with a group of riders. "Sullivan's advance team," he muttered, "creating a distraction while they secure the town." A new sound cut through the night, the heavy rumble of wagons. Tom's trained ear recognized the distinctive sound of mining equipment. They're not just here to intimidate. They're bringing in industrial equipment, everything needed to strip mine the entire valley once they've secured control. Sarah's eyes widened. That would destroy everything, the water table, the smaller claims, even the town itself. Exactly. Sullivan's not interested in traditional mining. He's after quick profits, no matter the cost to the territory. Tom's mind raced through implications and possibilities. "I need you to get word to Jimmy. Tell him to watch those wagons, note every piece of equipment. We'll need documentation of their true intentions." As Sarah slipped away, Tom extracted his Pinkerton journal from its hiding place. The pieces were finally coming together. Sullivan's operation wasn't just about claiming rich strikes. It was about fundamentally changing how mining was done. In the territory, small independent miners would be replaced by industrial operations, all controlled by Sullivan's banking consortium. The sound of approaching horses sent Tom into a deeper shadow. Through his mirror system, he observed Joel McPherson leading a group of armed men toward the bank. The scout's movement suggested he was securing locations for Sullivan's arrival. In his hidden cache, Tom's Pinkerton badge caught the moonlight. Its silver star a reminder of oaths sworn and debts still to be paid. The badge had been more than just a symbol of authority. It represented a commitment to justice that went beyond simple law enforcement. Tom had walked away from that life, once seeking peace in the solitude of his claim, but some legacies couldn't be abandoned. They could only be fulfilled. Dawn was approaching, bringing with it Sullivan's stage and the confrontation Tom had spent 3 years preparing for. The quiet prospector, the skilled investigator, and the determined agent were finally merging into something new. A man who would use every skill and identity at his disposal to protect not just his claim, but the future of the entire territory. The morning stage arrived in Trinity Falls with an escort of 6 armed riders, their presence announcing Patrick Sullivan's importance more clearly than any words could. Tom watched from the hidden observation point he'd prepared in the abandoned print shop, noting how Sullivan's men had positioned themselves throughout the town. Their deployment suggested military training. These weren't ordinary gunmen, but professional security specialists. Sullivan himself emerged from the stage looking exactly as Tom remembered, immaculately dressed in a London-tailored suit, his silver hair and patrician features projecting an image of respectability that had fooled so many. The banker's eyes swept the street with calculated precision, missing nothing. "Welcome to Trinity Falls, Mr. Sullivan," Judge Morton called out, hurrying forward with Whitmore close behind. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "Spare me the pleasantries," Sullivan replied, his cultured voice carrying clearly to Tom's. "Position." "Have you secured the records I requested?" "Most of them, sir, though there have been some complications." Sullivan's expression didn't change, but his tone carried deadly promise. "I don't pay you for complications, Judge. I will pay you for the results." Through his carefully positioned mirrors, Tom observed Hayes and McPherson approaching from the direction of the bank, their manner suggesting urgent news. The claim jumper's face showed barely concealed anger. Something had gone wrong with their plans. "Sir," Hayes reported, keeping his voice low, "we've got a problem. That Prospector Blackwood, his claim papers don't match the registry. The ones he filed show different boundaries than what's recorded in Sacramento." Tom allowed himself a slight smile. 3 years of careful preparation were beginning to bear fruit. He'd filed multiple sets of claim papers, each containing subtle discrepancies that would only become apparent when compared directly. The resulting confusion would force Sullivan's operation to slow down, double-checking everything. "Find him," Sullivan ordered, "and find out who he really is. No simple prospector. Plays games with claim registrations." "That's not all," McPherson added. "The Chen family's store. Their records show shipments and transactions that don't appear in the official books, like they're running a separate operation we can't track." Tom's smile widened. Sarah and her father had played their parts perfectly, maintaining 2 sets of books, one showing normal business, the other containing carefully crafted misinformation that would send Sullivan's men chasing shadows. Through the morning, Tom moved carefully through his network of observation posts, watching Sullivan's operation begin to unravel. The bankers. Men searched increasingly desperate locations, finding only more questions. Each discovery forced them to expand their investigation, spreading their resources thinner. "Mr. Blake?" Tom turned to find Jimmy Chen in the shadows of the print shop's backroom, the boy's usual cheerful expression replaced by urgency. "Marshal McKenna's deputy just rode in. He's got papers from the territorial governor." This was the first result of Tom's coded telegraph message. The deputy would be carrying documents that officially suspended Judge Morton's authority, pending an investigation into corruption charges. It wouldn't stop Sullivan completely, but it would complicate his legal maneuvering. "There's more," Jimmy continued. "That mining equipment they brought in. Pa recognized some of the serial numbers, says they were reported stolen from the Silver State Mining Company last month." Tom's mind raced through implications. Silver State was one of Sullivan's legitimate operations, which meant he's using stolen equipment from his own company, Tom mused. Probably planning to file an insurance claim after the job's done. Double profits. But the stolen equipment created an opportunity. Tom extracted a carefully prepared document from his hidden cache, a wanted circular describing the theft, complete with matching serial numbers. One copy to the marshal's office would force Sullivan to either abandon the equipment or risk drawing. "Official attention. Take this to Deputy Wilson," he instructed Jimmy. "Make sure he understands its importance." As the boy slipped away, Tom heard raised voices from the direction of the hotel. Through his mirror system, he observed Sullivan, confronting Whitmore and Judge Morton in the banker's private office. 3 years of preparation," Sullivan was saying, his controlled tone carrying more menace than a shout. 3 years of buying officials, positioning assets, arranging for this exact moment. And you're telling me it's all being disrupted by a prospector and a Chinese shopkeeper? There's something wrong with Blackwood's claim, Whitmore protested. The boundaries, the registration dates, nothing matches properly, and the Chen family's records suggest gold shipments we never tracked. It's like what? Like someone knew we were coming, knew exactly how to confuse our investigation. Sullivan's expression shifted slightly, the first hint of uncertainty Tom had seen. "Show me everything, every document, every discrepancy, every suspicious detail." Tom watched as Sullivan's men laid out papers across Whitmore's desk. The banker studied each one with the attention to detail that had made him so dangerous. Gradually, his expression changed from confusion to dawning recognition. "These patterns," Sullivan said slowly, "the way the discrepancies are structured, the attention to detail, I've seen this before. Carson City, 3 years ago." Tom tensed. This was the moment he'd both anticipated and dreaded, when Sullivan would begin to recognize the true nature of his opposition. "Sir?" Hayes questioned. "The Pinkerton agent, Blake. Hawkeye Blake. This is exactly how he worked. Creating patterns of conflicting evidence, using our own verification processes against us." Sullivan's voice carried both anger and grudging admiration. "We thought he died in the Carson City operation." "What are you saying?" Judge Morton asked nervously. "I'm saying, gentlemen, that we're not dealing with a simple prospector. We're facing a man who spent years planning this moment, a man who knows exactly how we operate because he once came very close to destroying our entire organization." Tom moved silently away from his observation post. Sullivan's recognition of his methods would force the banker to change tactics. The next few hours would be crucial. In the hidden room beneath the Chen store, Tom found Sarah waiting with fresh intelligence. "They're searching everyone's claims now," she reported, "looking for more discrepancies. And Hayes's men are gathering records from every business in town, trying to establish a pattern." "Good," Tom replied, surprising her. "The more they search, the more inconsistencies they'll find. Each one forces them to look deeper, commit more resources to investigation rather than action. But they know who you are now. They suspect. Sullivan recognized my methods, but he can't be certain. That uncertainty will make him even more cautious, more thorough in his checking. And every hour he spends investigating is another hour for our plans to mature." Through carefully concealed peepholes, they watched Sullivan's men hurrying through the streets, their former confidence replaced by worried efficiency. The banker's recognition of Tom's involvement had transformed their simple takeover operation into something far more complex. "Deputy Wilson's serving the suspension papers to Judge Morton now," Sarah reported. "And Pa says 3 more claims reported stolen equipment matching Sullivan's mining machinery." Tom nodded in satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place. Sullivan had arrived expecting to find a disorganized community ripe for takeover. Instead, he'd walked into a carefully prepared web of legal complications, document discrepancies, and strategic confusion. "He'll move against the Chen store next," Tom predicted. "Your family's records are causing him too many problems. Are you ready?" Sarah's smile carried the same quiet determination that had made her such a valuable ally. "Everything important is already hidden in the tunnel system. Let them search. They'll find exactly what we want them to find." As if on cue, they heard Hayes's voice outside, ordering his men to surround the store. Tom touched his hidden Remington for reassurance, then moved toward one of his prepared escape routes. The next few hours would determine whether his 3 years of preparation had been enough to counter Sullivan's decades of corruption. The quiet prospector had laid his trap well. Now it was time for the Pinkerton agent to spring it. Through the network of tunnels, Tom made his way to another observation post near the hotel. Sullivan's reaction to the mounting complications had been revealing. The banker's carefully maintained facade of respectability had cracked, showing glimpses of the ruthless operator beneath. "Search everything," Sullivan's voice carried from the hotel's private dining room. "Every claim, every business, every shipment record for the past 3 years. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." "Sir," Hayes protested, "that kind of thorough search will take days. The town meeting is tomorrow." "The meeting is postponed. I won't move until I'm certain of every detail." Blake was too good at creating false trails. "One mistake now could expose everything we've built," Tom smiled grimly. Sullivan's caution was playing directly into his strategy. The banker's insistence on absolute certainty would paralyze his operation at exactly the moment they needed to move quickly. A soft tap on the wall alerted him to Jimmy's approach through the tunnel system. The boy's face was flushed with excitement. "Marshal, McKenna's deputy did more than just suspend Judge Morton," he whispered. "He's also frozen the bank's assets pending investigation. Whitmore's in a panic. They can't access the funds they need for bribes and payoffs." This was better than Tom had hoped. Without ready cash, Sullivan's operation would struggle to maintain control over its local allies. Already he could see signs of strain. Hayes's men were arguing about payment, and several of Judge Morton's clerks had suddenly developed convenient illnesses. Through his mirror system, Tom observed a heated exchange between Sullivan and Whitmore in the banker's office. "This goes beyond simple claim jumping," Sullivan was saying, his cultured voice tight with anger. "Blake's attacking the entire foundation of our operation. The document discrepancies, the conflicting shipment records, the equipment serial numbers. He's creating a paper trail that could expose everything." "We could still push through the claim transfers," Whitmore suggested. "The federal judge arrives tomorrow." "Your pet judge won't help if Blake has evidence linking him to our previous operations." "No, we need to find him first. Eliminate the threat before proceeding." A knock at the door interrupted them. Joel McPherson entered, his expression troubled. "Sir, we found something at the Chen's store. Hidden ledgers showing gold shipments from claims we've never heard of. And there's more. Some of the entries match dates and amounts from operations in Nevada, operations that were supposed to be completely secret." Tom's pulse quickened. This was the key piece of his strategy. Carefully crafted records that appeared to connect Sullivan's current activities to past crimes. The banker would have to investigate every entry, verifying that his old operations hadn't been compromised. "How?" Sullivan demanded. "How could Chinese merchants have records of our Nevada business?" "That's not all," McPherson continued. "We found this in their basement." He produced a familiar-looking document, one of the false leads Tom had carefully planted. "It's a letter mentioning the Carson City incident, specifically naming people who were supposed to be there." Sullivan snatched the paper, his face darkening as he read. "This is impossible. These details were never made public, unless—" His head snapped up. "Unless Blake didn't work alone, he had help here, local allies preparing for this moment." Tom moved silently through the tunnel system, heading for his next position. Sullivan's realization about local allies would force him to question everyone, further fracturing the trust within his organization. Near the telegraph office, he encountered Sarah Chen, making her own careful observations. "Hayes's men are deserting," she reported quietly. "Without payment from the bank, they're starting to drift away, and those who remain are arguing about who's in charge. Sullivan's reputation is built on power and money," Tom explained. "Take away either, and his control starts to crumble. But he's most dangerous when cornered. We need to be ready for his next move." As if in response to his words, they heard the distinctive sound of mining machinery being started up. Through carefully placed peepholes, they observed Sullivan's crew beginning to set up equipment near the creek. "They're going to start mining operations anyway," Sarah realized, "even without legal approval." "Sullivan's getting desperate," Tom nodded. "He knows his window of opportunity is closing. If he can extract enough gold quickly, he might still salvage something from this operation." But the mining activity created new opportunities. Tom extracted a carefully prepared document from his cache, geological surveys showing how the planned excavation would damage the town's water supply. "Get this to Deputy Wilson," he instructed Sarah. "One copy to him, one to the newspaper office. The townspeople need to understand exactly what Sullivan's operation will cost them." Through the afternoon, Tom watched his strategies bear fruit. The suspended judge, the frozen bank assets, the evidence of corruption, and the threat to the town's water, each piece worked to isolate Sullivan and erode his support. But the banker was far from defeated. Through his observation network, Tom spotted Sullivan's men converting the hotel's dining room into a command center. Maps and documents covered every surface as they tried to unravel the web of evidence Tom had spent years weaving. "Sir," Hayes reported, entering with fresh papers, "we found another set of claim registration documents. These show completely different boundaries than either the local registry or the Sacramento files." Sullivan's expression was murderous. "How many sets of documents did Blake create?" "That's just it. We can't tell which ones are real anymore. Every time we verify one set, we find contradictions in another. It's like what? Like the documents themselves are a trap. The more we investigate, the more tangled it gets." Tom allowed himself a grim smile. This was exactly what he'd intended, using Sullivan's own need for control and verification. against him. The banker couldn't move forward until he was certain of his legal position, but every attempt to establish that certainty only revealed more complications. In the deceptive quiet of late afternoon, Tom made his way back to the Chen store's hidden basement. His various strategies were working better than he'd dared hope, but Sullivan's growing desperation made him increasingly dangerous. Through the basement's concealed observation ports, he watched the banker's men continuing their increasingly frantic search for evidence. Each hour brought new complications, new questions, new reasons for Sullivan to delay his plans while seeking certainty. But Tom knew the banker's patience wouldn't last forever. Soon, Sullivan would be forced to either retreat or take decisive action, and if Tom had judged his opponent correctly, retreat wasn't in Sullivan's nature. The quiet prospector had indeed laid his trap well. Now it was time for the Pinkerton agent to prepare for the violent conclusion he knew was coming. A subtle series of taps echoed through the tunnel system, Jimmy Chen's alert signal. The boy emerged from a concealed passage, clutching a crumpled telegram. "Just intercepted this from the telegraph office," he whispered. "Sullivan sent for reinforcements. Professional gunmen from San Francisco, but look at the routing." Tom studied the telegram, his experienced eye catching the subtle code embedded in the seemingly routine message. "He's not just calling for gunmen," he translated. "He's activated his entire network. Banking connections, railroad interests, mining companies, all of them converging on Trinity Falls." "Is that bad?" Jimmy asked. "No." Tom smiled slightly. "It's exactly what we want. Sullivan's paranoia is working against him. By calling in his full network, he's putting all his conspirators in one place, makes them easier to expose." Through the basement's observation ports, they watched Sullivan's men continuing their search of the Chen store. The banker's professional crew had been joined by local miners working for Hayes, a tactical mistake that Tom had anticipated. The professionals worked methodically, but the locals were careless, missing crucial details while damaging property. "Unnecessarily. They're getting frustrated," Jimmy observed. "The professionals keep finding things the locals missed, but then those things lead nowhere. Because each piece of evidence is designed to connect to something else," Tom explained. "But the connections only make sense if you have all the pieces. Sullivan's men are finding fragments of a puzzle without knowing the full picture." A commotion from the street drew their attention. Through the network of mirrors, they observed Marshal McKenna's deputy posting notices on prominent buildings, official announcements of the investigation into judicial corruption. "Perfect timing," Tom murmured. The public notices would force Sullivan to deal with growing local awareness of his operation's illegality. Already, small groups of townspeople were gathering to read the announcements, their expressions shifting from confusion to anger. Sarah Chen appeared from another tunnel entrance, her face flushed with excitement. "Sullivan's men just found the false bottom in Parr's strongbox," she reported. "The one containing those special ledgers you prepared." Tom nodded in satisfaction. Those ledgers had been carefully crafted to suggest a vast conspiracy of small merchants and miners working together to resist corporate takeovers. Sullivan would waste precious time and resources investigating this phantom network. "There's more," Sarah continued. "That mining equipment they started up, it's already causing problems. The vibrations are damaging building foundations near the creek. People are starting to complain." This development played perfectly into Tom's strategy. The visible damage would turn public opinion firmly against Sullivan's operation, while the threat to property values would anger Trinity Falls business owners, even those who had been willing to cooperate with the takeover. Through his observation system, Tom watched Sullivan receiving this latest news in the hotel's makeshift command center. The banker's facade of civilized control was cracking further. "Shut down the machinery," Sullivan ordered. "We can't afford public opposition right now, not with Blake out there somewhere gathering evidence." "Sir," McPherson interjected. "About Blake, we found something interesting in the marshal's office. Old wanted posters, sealed correspondence from the Pinkerton agency. Seems our marshal had been quietly investigating corporate takeovers across the territory." Tom allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Those documents were yet another carefully prepared element of his strategy. Marshal McKenna had indeed been investigating, but the scope of his investigation had been greatly enhanced by evidence Tom had quietly provided over the past 3 years. The marshal wasn't working alone, Sullivan concluded grimly. Blake's been feeding him information, using him to build an official case while staying hidden himself. "What do you want us to do?" Hayes asked. "Find everyone who's been in contact with the marshal, everyone who might have helped Blake establish his cover here. I want to know every detail about every person in this town who—" He broke off as deputy. Wilson entered the room, accompanied by 2 territorial officials Tom didn't recognize. "Mr. Sullivan," the deputy announced formally. "These gentlemen are from the Territorial Banking Commission. They have some questions about certain financial irregularities that have come to light." Tom smiled in the darkness of his hiding place. The banking investigation was another piece of his strategy, timed to coincide with Sullivan's moment of greatest vulnerability. The banker would now have to choose between dealing with the official investigation or pursuing his search for Blake. He couldn't effectively do both. "Financial irregularities?" Sullivan's voice carried just a hint of strain. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this privately." "Not this time, Mr. Sullivan," one of the officials replied firmly. "We have documents suggesting a pattern of systematic fraud extending across 3 territories. The governor himself has taken an interest in this case." Tom watched Sullivan's expression carefully. The banker was too experienced to show obvious panic, but certain subtle signs, a tightening around the eyes, a slight tension in his jaw, revealed his growing awareness that events were spiraling beyond his control. Through the tunnel system, Tom made his way to another observation post near the bank. Whitmore was in his office, hurriedly packing documents into a vase. The local banker had clearly decided to abandon Sullivan's operation before it collapsed completely. "Pa says more riders are coming in," Jimmy reported, joining Tom at his position. "But not Sullivan's men this time. Miners from up and down the valley coming to see what's happening with their claims." This spontaneous gathering of miners was yet another complication for Sullivan to handle. Each new group arriving in Trinity Falls increased the pressure on his operation, forcing him to divide his attention and resources. Sarah appeared with fresh intelligence. "Sullivan's men found another set of documents in the judge's office," she whispered. "These ones suggest corruption in the Territorial Land Office." "Authentic documents?" Jimmy asked. "Some are," Tom replied, "mixed with carefully created duplicates. Sullivan will have to investigate each one, trying to determine which records are real and which are false. And every investigation will lead to more questions, more complications." A sudden burst of activity near the hotel caught their attention. Through the mirror system, they observed Sullivan's professional crew loading equipment into wagons, while Hayes argued with his increasingly unreliable local men. "They're pulling out," Sarah realized. "No," Tom corrected grimly. "They're consolidating. Sullivan's gathering his forces, preparing for a decisive move. All these complications, all these investigations, they're forcing him toward the one option he has left, which is violence. If he can't take control legally, he'll try to take it by force. Create enough chaos to destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, and escape before official law enforcement can respond." Tom checked his Remingtons with practiced care. The quiet prospectors. Strategic trap had worked perfectly, pushing Sullivan exactly where he wanted him. Now it was time for the Pinkerton agent to prepare for the violent confrontation he had spent 3 years orchestrating. The final act was about to begin, and Tom intended to ensure that this time Patrick Sullivan would not escape justice. Dusk settled over Trinity Falls like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the kind of tense quiet that Tom recognized from his Pinkerton days. The calm before violence. Through his observation network, he watched Sullivan's men fortifying key positions around town. The banker was preparing for a siege, though most townspeople hadn't yet realized it. In the Chen store's hidden basement, Tom met with his growing circle of allies. Sarah and Jimmy had gathered key members of the Chinese community, merchants, laborers, and miners who had faced discrimination from Sullivan's operations in other territories. Each brought valuable skills and, more importantly, connections to a hidden network of information and resources. Sullivan's men are blocking the main roads, elderly Mr. Wong reported in careful English. But they don't know about the old mining trails. My crews can still move through the high country. Tom nodded appreciatively. The Chinese miners had maintained their own secret routes through the mountains, paths that wouldn't appear on any official maps. These would prove crucial in the coming hours. What about the telegraph office? He asked Li Wei, who worked as a maintenance man for the Western Union Company. They watched the main office very closely, Li replied. But the emergency line to Sacramento still works, hidden in the maintenance shed. They never think to check there. This confirmed another advantage. While Sullivan controlled official communications, Tom's allies could still get messages out through backup channels. He'd already arranged for critical evidence to be transmitted to trusted contacts in the territorial capital. A soft knock at the concealed door announced Sarah's return from her reconnaissance. Sullivan's brought in more men, she reported, but they're not all gunfighters. I spotted at least 3 who look like bank examiners or accountants. He's still trying to unravel the paper trail, Tom mused. Good. The more resources he commits to investigation, the fewer he has for direct action. Through carefully hidden peepholes, they observed increasing activity around the hotel. Sullivan's professional crew was converting the building into a fortress, while Hayes' remaining local men patrolled the streets with growing nervousness. "Mr. Blake," a new voice called softly from the tunnel entrance. Tom turned to find Marcus Rodriguez, formerly a sergeant in the territorial militia and now the owner of Trinity Falls' largest freighting company. "Your message said it was urgent." Rodriguez continued, emerging into the dim lamplight. Something about Sullivan's operation, threatening the entire valley's transportation network. Tom extracted several carefully prepared documents from his cache. Sullivan's not just after the gold claims. His banking consortium is positioned to control all major shipping routes. Here's proof of how they've done it in other territories. Forcing out independent operators, then raising rates until small miners and merchants can't survive. Rodriguez studied the papers with growing anger. As the valley's primary freight operator, he understood exactly how such a monopoly would affect the community. More importantly, he had connections with other transportation companies throughout the territory. "I can have 50 Teamsters here by tomorrow noon," he offered. "Good men who know how to handle themselves. And every one of them has a personal stake in stopping Sullivan's kind of operation." Tom nodded in satisfaction. The Teamsters would provide crucial support, not just manpower, but the ability to move people and supplies quickly when needed. Their arrival would also demonstrate to Sullivan that his opposition wasn't limited to local forces. A subtle signal from his mirror network caught Tom's attention. Through the carefully positioned glasses, he observed Marshal McKenna's deputy engaged in intense conversation with Judge Morton. The judge's expression suggested the discussion wasn't going well. "Sarah," Tom called softly, "see what's happening there?" The young woman slipped away through the tunnel system, emerging a few minutes later with fresh intelligence. "The deputy's telling Morton that federal marshals are on their way from Sacramento. Real ones, not Sullivan's bought men. The judge is starting to crack, talking about turning evidence to save himself. This development required immediate attention. If Morton broke ranks, Sullivan might be forced to accelerate his plans. Tom quickly drafted a message to be sent through Leeway's emergency telegraph line, alerting his contacts in Sacramento to the situation. Through the afternoon, more allies arrived through various hidden routes. Old Pete Wilson brought word from the high country mining camps. Independent operators who had faced similar takeover attempts were gathering, ready to support resistance to Sullivan's operation. Got 30 hard rock miners coming down, Pete reported. Men who've had their claims. You jumped before. They're bringing dynamite too. Figure it might come in handy. Tom smiled grimly. The miners' explosives could serve multiple purposes, not just as weapons, but as tools to block roads or create diversions if needed. More importantly, their arrival would show Sullivan that his opposition included experienced fighting men. Commotion from the direction of the bank drew their attention. Through the observation system, they watched Whitmore arguing with Sullivan's professional crew. The local banker was clearly trying to distance himself from the operation, but Sullivan's men weren't letting him leave. He knows too much, Tom explained to his gathered allies. Sullivan can't risk him talking to the authorities. Same reason they're holding Marshal McKenna. Rodriguez studied the bank through a carefully positioned mirror. My teamsters could create a distraction. Get Whitmore out if you think he'd cooperate. Not yet, Tom replied. Whitmore's presence complicates things for Sullivan, forces him to commit men to watching his own allies instead of searching for us. As evening approached, Tom's network continued to grow. Sarah's contacts in the Chinese community provided access to hidden storage spaces throughout town, places where weapons and supplies could be cached for quick access. Jimmy's youthful energy and seemingly innocent appearance allowed him to move freely, gathering intelligence that Sullivan's men would never suspect a child of collecting. Through it all, Tom coordinated and planned, using skills honed during his Pinkerton years to weave individual assets into a cohesive operation. Each ally brought unique capabilities. The Chinese miners knew hidden mountain routes. Rodriguez's teamsters provided transportation and muscle. Pete's hard rock miners brought explosives and fighting experience. Leeway maintained secret communication lines. The Chen family's tunnels offered concealed movement through town. But Tom's greatest asset was information. Through careful preparation and strategic planning, he had created a situation where Sullivan's every move generated more complications. The banker's attempt to control the situation only served to spread his resources thinner, while Tom's network grew stronger and more coordinated. As darkness fell, Tom made his way to another observation post near the hotel. Through his mirror system, he watched Sullivan conducting a strategy session with his top men. The banker's familiar confidence had been replaced by barely contained fury, as reports of mounting complications continued to arrive. "Sir," Hayes reported, "those teamsters arriving in town, they're Rodriguez's men, known for fighting corporate takeovers in other territories. And the miners coming down from the high country," McPherson added. "They're not just local prospectors. These are experienced hard rock men, the kind who've dealt with claim jumpers before." Sullivan's expression darkened. "Blake's building an army," he concluded grimly, "using our own tactics against us, gathering forces while we waste time chasing paper trails and false leads. We still outnumber them," Hayes offered. "Numbers aren't everything," Sullivan snapped. "Blake's not just gathering fighters. He's building a network, transportation, communications, supply lines, the kind of organization that takes months to arrange, unless—" The banker's eyes narrowed as understanding dawned. "Unless it was already arranged. Blake didn't just hide here as a prospector. He spent 3 years preparing for exactly this moment, building connections and positioning resources while maintaining his cover." Tom smiled in the darkness of his hiding place. Sullivan had finally grasped the true nature of his opposition. Not just a former Pinkerton agent with a grudge, but a carefully orchestrated operation designed to dismantle his entire criminal empire. Through the tunnel system, Tom made his way back to the Chen store's basement. His allies were gathering for final preparations, each bringing reports of new developments. Rodriguez's teamsters were taking up strategic positions around town. Pete's miners had cached explosives at key locations. The Chinese network had established supply lines through the mountains. Li Wei's telegraph connection provided secure communication with Sacramento. Sullivan's getting desperate, Sarah reported after another reconnaissance. His men are setting up defensive positions, but they're spread thin, trying to watch too many approaches. Good, Tom replied. The more he tries to control, the weaker his actual control becomes. By tomorrow morning, he'll have to make a choice. Retreat and lose everything, or commit to violent action and risk official intervention. And if he chooses violence? Rodriguez asked. Tom's expression hardened. Then he'll discover that some problems can't be solved with money and hired guns. Sometimes justice requires a different kind of expertise, the kind that comes from years of hunting men, exactly like him. The quiet prospector had indeed spent 3 years preparing for this moment, but it wasn't just about gathering evidence or building a network. It was about creating a situation where Sullivan's own nature, his need for control, his reliance on force, his arrogance, would become the instruments of his destruction. Now, as Trinity Falls settled into an uneasy night, Tom Blackwood, or Hawkeye Blake, made his final preparations. Sullivan's desperate violence was coming, but when it arrived, it would find not just a single opponent, but an entire community ready to resist. A subtle tap from the tunnel entrance announced Jimmy's return. The boy's face was flushed with excitement as he delivered his report. Sullivan's men found something at the assay office, old records showing gold shipments to banks that don't exist. They're arguing about what it means. Tom nodded in satisfaction. Those false banking records were another carefully crafted element of his strategy. Sullivan's men would waste valuable time trying to trace non-existent financial connections, further spreading their already strained resources. Through his mirror network, he observed increasing tension among Sullivan's forces. The professional crew maintained their discipline, but Hayes' local men were showing signs of strain. Several had already slipped away into the night, unwilling to face what was coming. "There's more," Jimmy continued. "That mining engineer they brought in, he's worried about the equipment they set up, says the ground near the creek is unstable, something about old mine tunnels underneath." This was another aspect of Tom's preparation. During his 3 years as a prospector, he had carefully mapped the honeycomb of abandoned mines beneath Trinity Falls. Now that knowledge would serve a new purpose. Sarah emerged from another tunnel passage, accompanied by an elderly Chinese, man Tom recognized as Master Chen, no relation to the store owners, but a highly respected figure in the mining community. "My people remember old ways," Master Chen said softly. "When railroad men tried to drive us from claims, we learned to fight. Without fighting, make ground shifts, make water flow where they don't expect. Many accidents, very natural looking." Tom smiled. The Chinese miners had developed subtle methods of resistance during years of discrimination. Their knowledge of the old tunnels and underground waterways would prove invaluable in the coming conflict. Rodriguez returned from checking his teamsters' positions. "Got word from other freight companies," he reported. "They're sending men and wagons. By morning, we'll have every major transport operator in 3 territories represented." "Sullivan won't expect that level of organization," Tom mused. "He's used to dealing with isolated communities, picking them off one by one. The idea of coordinated resistance across territories will force him to recalculate his entire strategy." Through carefully hidden observation ports, they watched Sullivan's men fortifying the hotel. The banker had transformed the building into A command center, but his defensive preparations revealed his growing isolation. Each new barricade, each armed guard posted, demonstrated how his position of power had become a trap. "Mr. Blake," Leeway called softly from his telegraph position. "Message from Sacramento. Federal marshals delayed by washout on railroad line. Will not arrive until tomorrow evening." Tom processed this information quickly. The delay meant they needed to contain Sullivan's operation for longer than planned, but it also meant the banker would grow increasingly desperate as his options narrowed. A commotion from the direction of the bank caught their attention. Through the mirror system, they observed Whitmore attempting another escape, only to be forcibly returned to his office by Sullivan's men. "He's cracking," Sarah observed. "They all are. Even Judge Morton started drinking heavily." "Fear does." "Of that," Tom replied, "men like Sullivan rule through money and violence. When those stop working, their subordinates realize how vulnerable they really are." Pete Wilson returned from coordinating with his hard rock miners. "Got the charges set, just like you said," he reported. "Anyone tries moving heavy equipment down Main Street, we can bring down half the cliff face, make it look like a natural rock slide." This was another layer of Tom's strategy, using the territory itself as a weapon. Sullivan's operation required large-scale equipment to be profitable. Blocking the main transportation routes would severely limit his options. Through the evening, more allies arrived through various hidden routes. Each brought unique capabilities that Tom carefully wove into his plans. A group of Mexican vaqueros, experts at moving through rough country undetected, former buffalo hunters with long-range shooting skills, riverboat pilots who knew every hidden cove and landing along the waterways, even a telegraph operator who had once worked for Sullivan's bank, familiar with their codes and procedures, building quite an army, Rodriguez observed. "Not an army," Tom corrected. "A community. Sullivan's weakness is thinking everything can be bought or controlled. He doesn't understand the power of people fighting for their homes and livelihoods." A signal from the mirror network drew their attention. Through the carefully positioned glasses, they observed increasing activity around the hotel. Sullivan's men were moving equipment, consolidating their forces. "They're preparing for something," Sarah said quietly. "Yes," Tom agreed. Sullivan's realized he can't win through normal methods. The paper trail is too complicated, the opposition too organized. He'll try something dramatic, probably at dawn. It's his favorite time for violent operations. "How do you know?" "Because I spent months studying his methods during the Curry Gang investigation. Sullivan has patterns he doesn't even recognize himself. When pressured, he always chooses dawn attacks, thinks the early light gives his men an advantage." Through the tunnel system, Tom led his core allies to another observation post. From this position, they could see Sullivan himself pacing in his hotel room, issuing orders to his lieutenants. "Look at his gestures," Tom instructed. "Short, sharp movements. He's planning something aggressive. When Sullivan gets like this, he typically commits all his forces to a single, overwhelming attack." "Is that bad?" Jimmy asked. "No," Tom smiled slightly. "It's exactly what we want. A man like Sullivan is most vulnerable when he thinks he's being strongest. By committing everything to one attack, he'll expose himself completely." As midnight approached, Tom made his final preparations. Each element of his network was carefully positioned. Rodriguez's teamsters controlled key transportation routes. Pete's miners had rigged strategic choke points with explosives. The Chinese community maintained hidden supply lines. Former buffalo hunters held elevated shooting positions. Vaqueros patrolled the outskirts, watching for flanking movements. Telegraph operators monitored all communications. The Chen family's tunnel network provided concealed movement throughout town, but most importantly, each group understood its role in the larger strategy. This wasn't just about fighting Sullivan's men. It was about demonstrating that his entire method of operation was fundamentally flawed. Through his years as a Pinkerton agent, Tom had learned that the most effective way to stop men like Sullivan wasn't just to defeat them, but to expose the bankruptcy of their entire approach. By showing that communities could successfully resist corporate takeovers, they would make such operations less attractive to future investors. As Trinity Falls settled into tense anticipation of dawn, Tom Blackwood, or Hawkeye Blake, reviewed his preparations one final time. Sullivan's violence was coming, but when it arrived, it would find something unprecedented. A community united in resistance, armed with both physical resources and strategic intelligence. The quiet prospector had spent 3 years building this network, preparing for exactly this moment. Now it was time to show Patrick Sullivan that some things couldn't be controlled through money and force, that justice, when properly organized, was more powerful than any corporate empire. A subtle vibration through the floorboards alerted Tom to movement in the hotel above. Through his carefully positioned mirrors, he observed Sullivan gathering his lieutenants for a final strategy session. "Sir," Hayes reported, "we've got another problem. Those Mexican vaqueros who arrived tonight, they're Ramirez's men." Sullivan's expression darkened. "Miguel Ramirez, the rancher who caused us so much trouble in Arizona?" "The same. And there's more. We've identified some of those buffalo hunters. They're Pinkerton men, retired but still sharp." This revelation brought Tom a surge of satisfaction. His old colleagues had responded to his coded message, bringing their specialized skills to support his operation. More importantly, their presence would further unnerve Sullivan, reminding him of past encounters with the agency. Through the tunnel system, Sarah guided a new arrival to Tom's position. A woman in her 50s, dressed in practical riding clothes. Kate Morrison had once been Sullivan's personal secretary until she discovered evidence of his criminal activities. Now she was a key witness in the federal investigation. "Your message said it was urgent," Kate said without preamble. "That you had proof linking Sullivan to the Carson City massacre." Tom extracted several documents from his hidden cache. Bank transfers, coded telegrams, and meeting records, all showing Sullivan orchestrated the entire incident. He used the Curry Gang to eliminate witnesses while destroying evidence of his larger operation. Kate studied the papers with growing excitement. "This is exactly what the federal investigators need. But how did you get these records? Sullivan's men destroyed everything during the raid." "Not everything," Tom smiled slightly. "I spent months preparing duplicate documents, storing them in multiple locations. When Sullivan's men torched the railroad office, they only destroyed the obvious copies." A signal from Jimmy drew their attention to new activity on the street. Through the observation network, they watched as Sullivan's men began moving heavy equipment toward the creek. "They're planning to start mining operations at dawn," Sarah reported. "Full industrial scale, regardless of legal approval." "Desperate move," Rodriguez commented. "Once that equipment starts up, there's no pretending this is legitimate business anymore." Tom nodded in agreement. Sullivan's running out of options. The federal investigation, the organized resistance, the exposed paper trail, everything he's built is crumbling. All he has left is brute force. Through carefully hidden peepholes, they observed increasing tension among Sullivan's forces. The professional crew maintained their discipline, but several of Hayes's local men were openly arguing about payment and risks. "There's something else," Master Chen added, emerging from another tunnel passage. "My people in the hills spot more. Riders coming, not Sullivan's men, settlers from other valleys. Word spread about resistance here. They come to help." This was an unexpected but welcome development. News of Trinity Falls' organized opposition to corporate takeover was inspiring others who had faced similar threats. Each new arrival strengthened not just their fighting force, but the symbolic importance of their resistance. Li Wei appeared with fresh intelligence from his telegraph monitoring. "Sullivan sent many messages tonight. to banks, to railroad offices, to mining companies, all asking for help, for money, for men. But answers are not good. Other business partners getting nervous, don't want attention from federal investigators. His network's fracturing, Tom explained to his gathered allies. Sullivan's power comes from combining legitimate business with criminal operations. Once that connection is exposed, his legitimate partners start distancing themselves. A commotion from the bank drew their attention. Through the mirror system, they watched Whitmore arguing violently with Sullivan's guards. The local banker had finally broken under pressure, threatening to reveal everything unless allowed to leave. "Should we help him escape?" Sarah asked. "He might be willing to testify." "Not yet," Tom replied. "Let Sullivan deal with the problem. Every man he commits to watching Whitmore is one less man available for other operations." Pete Wilson returned from another scouting mission, his weathered face troubled. "They're setting up demolition charges along the creek bed," he reported. "Looks like they're planning to redirect the entire water flow." This confirmed Tom's assessment of Sullivan's desperation. The banker was preparing to physically alter the landscape, making any legal disputes about water rights irrelevant. "Perfect," Tom said quietly, surprising his allies. "The more damage they do, the more evidence they create. Every charge they set, every piece of equipment they position, just strengthens the federal case against them." Through the night, Tom's network continued to grow and adapt. Each new development brought fresh opportunities. The arriving settlers provided additional manpower and local knowledge. Kate Morrison's testimony would strengthen the legal case. The Chinese miners' understanding of underground waterways could counter Sullivan's demolition plans. Rodriguez's teamsters controlled crucial supply lines. The buffalo hunters' shooting skills covered key approaches. The vaqueros' mobility provided tactical flexibility, but Tom's greatest advantage was psychological. Sullivan's increasing desperation was affecting his judgment, pushing him toward exactly the kind of dramatic action that would prove most damaging to his organization. "Look at his movements," Tom instructed his core allies, observing Sullivan through their mirror network. "The rapid pacing, the sharp gestures, he's building toward violence. By dawn, he'll convince himself that one overwhelming show of force can solve everything." "How can you be so sure?" Kate asked. "Because I spent months studying him during the Curry investigation. Sullivan has patterns he doesn't recognize in himself. When pressured, he always chooses dramatic action over careful strategy. He thinks power comes from fear and force." Through the tunnel system, Tom led a final inspection of their preparations. Each element was carefully positioned. Explosive charges set to counter Sullivan's demolition plans. Hidden shooting positions covering likely attack routes, multiple escape routes and rally points established, supply caches distributed throughout town, communication systems redundantly backed up, medical stations prepared for potential casualties. But most importantly, every member of the network understood their role in the larger strategy. This wasn't just about defeating Sullivan's men. It was about demonstrating a new model of resistance to corporate takeovers. As Trinity Falls held, its breath waiting for dawn, Tom Blackwood, or Hawkeye Blake, reviewed his final preparations. The quiet prospector had indeed spent 3 years building this network, preparing for exactly this moment. Now it was time to show Patrick Sullivan that true power came not from money or violence, but from communities united in the cause of justice. The first hint of dawn had barely touched the eastern sky when Sullivan made his move. Through his observation network, Tom watched the banker's men begin rolling heavy mining equipment toward Whiskey Creek. The machinery's rumble echoed through the quiet streets of Trinity Falls, a deliberate show of force meant to intimidate the town. "Bold strategy," Rodriguez muttered from their hidden position, "moving in broad daylight, not even trying to hide their intentions anymore." "Because Sullivan thinks he's untouchable," Tom replied, checking his Remingtons with practiced care. He's used to opposition crumbling in the face of overwhelming industrial might. Through carefully positioned mirrors, they observed Sullivan himself emerging from the hotel, surrounded by his professional security detail. The banker's usual polish had been replaced by grim determination as he supervised the equipment deployment. "Start the pumps," Sullivan ordered. "I want that creek bed dry by noon. Let's see how defiant these miners feel when their claims have no water access." But as the first massive pump roared to life, Tom's carefully laid plans began to unfold. Master Chen's miners had spent the night subtly altering the underground water channels, using techniques perfected through generations of resistance to corporate exploitation. The pump's powerful suction encountered unexpected crosscurrents, causing the machinery to shudder dangerously. "Something's wrong," the mining engineer shouted over the mechanical noise. "The water's not flowing right. There's too much pressure." "From below," Sullivan's face darkened. "Fix it. I don't care what it takes. Get those pumps working." Through the tunnel system, Tom led his core team to their next position. The banker's focus on the creek operation had left other areas vulnerable, exactly as planned. "Now, Sarah," he signaled. The young woman quickly passed the word through their network. Within minutes, Rodriguez's teamsters began moving wagons into carefully chosen positions, gradually cutting off access routes to the mining equipment. Each wagon appeared to be simply going about legitimate business, but together they formed an increasingly tight cordon around Sullivan's operation. Meanwhile, Pete Wilson's hard rock miners initiated another phase of the plan. Strategic charges, set during the night in abandoned mine shafts, were detonated in careful sequence. The explosions were small, barely noticeable on the surface, but they created subtle ground shifts that further destabilized the heavy mining equipment. "Sir," Hayes called out urgently, "we've got problems at the bank. Whitmore's threatening to open the vault to federal investigators unless we let him leave town." Sullivan's expression shifted from anger to calculation. "Take 4 men. Make sure he doesn't become a problem." But as Hayes gathered his team, Tom's network was already moving. Kate Morrison, Sullivan's former secretary, had spent the night documenting the bank's hidden records. Now, as Hayes approached the bank, she was transmitting that evidence through Leeway's secret telegraph line to federal authorities. "More riders coming in," Jimmy reported from his observation post. "Looks like independent miners from up valley. Word spread about Sullivan trying to dam the creek." This development forced Sullivan to split his forces further. The arriving miners weren't part of Tom's organized resistance, but their spontaneous gathering served his strategy perfectly. Each new group requiring surveillance stretched the banker's resources thinner. Through the morning, Tom's carefully orchestrated pressure began to tell. Sullivan's operation, designed for quick, overwhelming force, found itself increasingly entangled in multiple smaller conflicts. The mining equipment continued to malfunction mysteriously. Teamsters' wagons restricted access to critical areas. Independent miners gathered in growing numbers. The bank situation demanded constant attention. Underground explosions created persistent instability. Telegraph lines carried evidence to authorities. Local supporters began quietly abandoning Sullivan's cause. "This isn't just bad luck," Sullivan growled, studying reports from his increasingly frustrated lieutenants. "Someone's coordinating this resistance. Someone who knows our methods, our weaknesses." Tom watched through his mirror network as the banker's legendary self-control began to crack. Sullivan's power had always depended on careful orchestration of legitimate and illegal operations. Now that coordination was unraveling in ways he couldn't effectively counter. "Sir," McPherson reported urgently, "we've got more problems. Those buffalo hunters on the ridgeline, they're picking off our demolition teams one by one, precise, long-range shots, the kind that take serious training." Sullivan's response was cut short by a new commotion. Through the observation system, they watched Hayes returning from the bank, his expression grim. "Whitmore's gone," the claim jumper reported, "disappeared through some kind of hidden tunnel system. And he took documents with him, records of all your banking operations in the territory." This news hit Sullivan like a physical blow. Whitmore's escape with incriminating documents threatened the legitimate business facade that protected his entire criminal enterprise. "Find him!" Sullivan's controlled facade finally cracked. "Find him, and those documents, or everything we've built here is worthless." But even as his men began searching, Tom's network was implementing the next phase of their strategy. Whitmore hadn't actually escaped. He was being held securely in one of the Chen store's hidden chambers. The missing documents were already on their way to federal authorities through multiple secure routes. As noon approached, Sullivan's position had deteriorated significantly. His mining equipment sat useless, plagued by mysterious malfunctions. His forces were scattered, chasing multiple threats. His local supporters were quietly disappearing. His legitimate business cover was threatened by missing documents. His professional crew was being systematically reduced by precise rifle fire. His control of the town was increasingly illusory. Through it all, Tom coordinated his network's activities with the same strategic precision that had made him the Pinkerton agency's most effective operative. Each pressure point was carefully chosen, each countermove anticipated and prepared for. "Sir," a new urgency in Hayes's voice drew Sullivan's attention. "Telegram from Sacramento. The banking commission's frozen all your accounts pending investigation of irregular transfers." This development struck at the heart of Sullivan's power. Without access to his funds, he couldn't pay his men or maintain his legitimate business operations. "Blake," Sullivan said softly, the name carrying decades of frustrated rage. "This has to be Blake. Only he could coordinate something this comprehensive." The banker's realization came too late. Through the morning's careful maneuvering, Tom's network had systematically dismantled Sullivan's control of Trinity Falls. The banker still had men and weapons, but his ability to effectively coordinate them had been shattered. More importantly, the morning's events had demonstrated something crucial to the watching town. Sullivan's operation could be successfully resisted. The banker's aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated through years of unopposed takeovers, had been broken. As Sullivan stormed back to his hotel headquarters, Tom allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The quiet Prospector's first major victory had been achieved not through direct confrontation, but through careful coordination of multiple smaller actions. The banker's own tendency toward overwhelming force had been used against him, drawing his resources into exposed positions where they could be systematically neutralized. But Tom knew this was only the first phase of their conflict. Sullivan still had significant resources and a reputation for vicious retaliation. The banker's next move would be more desperate, more violent, and Tom's network would need to be ready for an entirely different kind of battle. Through the tunnel system, he gathered his core allies for planning. The morning's victory had proven their strategy effective, but it had also revealed Sullivan's capabilities and limitations. The next phase would require even more careful coordination. As Trinity Falls settled into an uneasy afternoon calm, Tom Blackwood, or Hawkeye Blake, prepared his network for what was coming. They had won the first major confrontation, but Sullivan's desperate violence was still to come. The quiet Prospector had demonstrated that organized resistance could defeat corporate power. Now it was time to show that justice could triumph over pure force. Through his mirror network, Tom observed Sullivan's men regrouping around the hotel. The morning's debacle had shaken their confidence, but it had also made them more dangerous. Professional gunmen were like wounded predators, most lethal when cornered. "Movement at the telegraph office," Sarah reported, emerging from a tunnel passage. Sullivan's sending messages to every bank and railroad office in 3 territories, offering substantial bonuses for immediate reinforcements. "Let him waste his time," Tom replied. "Those telegrams won't reach their destinations. Leeway's people have control of all outgoing lines now." Kate Morrison studied the banker through a carefully positioned mirror. "I've never seen him like this," she observed. "Patrick Sullivan built his empire on always being the calmest man in any crisis. But now," she was right. Sullivan's usual, calculated precision had been replaced by barely controlled fury as he berated his lieutenants. Through the observation system, they watched him slam his fist into a table, sending papers flying. "This is more than just anger over a failed operation," Tom explained. "Sullivan's realizing that his entire method of doing business is being exposed. Every tactic that worked for him in the past is being turned against him." A subtle signal from Jimmy drew their attention to new developments. The boy had been monitoring Sullivan's professional crew, noting their deployments and discussions. "They're arguing about payment," he reported. "Some want to leave, saying it's not worth the risk anymore. Hayes is trying to hold them together." But this was another aspect of Tom's strategy bearing fruit. By freezing Sullivan's accounts and disrupting his communications, they had undermined the key factor that kept his mercenaries loyal: guaranteed payment for services. Through carefully hidden observation ports, they watched the tension among Sullivan's men increasing. The professionals maintained their discipline, but their movements showed growing uncertainty. More telling was the complete disappearance of local supporters. Hayes' recruited miners and townsmen had melted away entirely. "Sir!" McPherson's urgent call drew Sullivan's attention. "Riders coming in from Eagle Canyon. Looks like every independent miner in the territory is heading this way." Tom smiled slightly. Word of successful resistance to Sullivan's operation was spreading, drawing others who had faced similar corporate takeovers. Each new arrival further shifted the balance of power, but the morning's victory had revealed crucial information about their opponent. Through his mirror network, Tom watched Sullivan's response to the mounting crisis, noting telling details: the banker's instinctive reach for his watch chain when agitated, his tendency to pace exactly 7 steps when thinking, the way he positioned his men in triangular formations, his habit of touching his left cuff before giving important orders. "You're studying him," Sarah observed. "Like you did during the Curry investigation." "A man's habits reveal his thinking," Tom replied. "Sullivan's patterns show military training, probably officer class during the war. That explains his tactical preferences and his emphasis on overwhelming force." A commotion from the bank drew their attention. Through the observation system, they watched as several of Sullivan's men rushed to respond to some new crisis. "Perfect timing," Tom murmured. "Rodriguez, is your team ready?" The freighter nodded grimly. While Sullivan's men were distracted by the bank incident, actually a carefully staged diversion, Rodriguez's teamsters began moving wagons into new positions, gradually tightening the cordon around the hotel. Master Chen appeared with fresh intelligence from his mining network. "Water pressure building in old tunnels," he reported. "When Sullivan's men try starting pumps again." He didn't need to finish. The Chinese miners had spent hours redirecting underground streams, turning the natural water table into a weapon. Any attempt to restart the industrial pumps would result in catastrophic equipment failure. Through the tunnel system, Tom led his core allies to another observation post. From this position, they could see Sullivan's entire operation beginning to fragment. Professional gunmen arguing over payment and risk. Hayes desperately trying to maintain control. McPherson's scouts reporting more arriving miners. Telegraph. Operators unable to contact reinforcements. Equipment teams struggling with mysterious malfunctions. Bank guards discovering more missing documents. "Look at his face," Kate said softly, observing her former employer. He's realizing that money and force aren't enough anymore. She was right. Sullivan's expression showed something beyond anger. Now, a growing fear as he recognized that his usual methods of control were failing systematically. "Mr. Blake," Li Wei called quietly from his telegraph position. "Message from Sacramento. Federal marshals advancing despite railroad delays. Will arrive by noon tomorrow." This news required careful handling. Tom knew Sullivan had informants. In the federal marshal's office, the banker would learn of their approach soon enough. The timing of that discovery needed to be carefully managed. "Send coded warnings to our people in the high passes," he instructed. "Sullivan will likely try to block the marshal's approach once he knows they're coming. We need those routes secured." Through the afternoon, Tom's network continued consolidating. Their gains from the morning's victory. Each new development further eroded Sullivan's position. More independent miners arriving hourly. Local supporters completely abandoned his cause. Professional crew increasingly unreliable. Equipment thoroughly sabotaged. Communications systematically controlled. Evidence steadily accumulating with authorities. Escape routes gradually closing. But Tom knew better than to underestimate his opponent. Sullivan hadn't built his criminal empire through weakness. The banker's next move would be bold, probably violent, a desperate attempt to regain control through overwhelming force. "He's calling his officers," Sarah reported, watching through their observation system. "Something's coming. He has that look." Tom knew the look she meant. He'd seen it during the Carson City operation. The cold determination that preceded Sullivan's most violent actions. The banker was preparing to abandon pretense and strike directly. Through careful preparation and coordinated effort, the quiet prospector had won the first major confrontation. Sullivan's attempt to seize control of Trinity Falls through industrial might have been systematically dismantled, but that victory had pushed the banker toward desperate measures, setting the stage for an even more dangerous conflict. As the sun began its westward descent, Tom Blackwood, or Hawkeye Blake, gathered his allies for planning. They had demonstrated that organized resistance could defeat corporate power. Now they needed to prepare for Sullivan's inevitable response. The kind of vicious retaliation that had made him legendary in 3 territories. Movement at the assay office, Jimmy reported, slipping into their hidden command post. "Sullivan's men are gathering all the claim registration documents they can find, and they're not being careful anymore, just grabbing everything." Through his mirror network, Tom observed the increasingly desperate operation. Sullivan's men were abandoning their previous methodical approach, resorting to crude force in their search for documents. "They're panicking," Kate Morrison observed. "Usually, Sullivan's operations maintain perfect documentation. Every action legally justified, every transaction properly recorded. This kind of chaos isn't his style at all." She was right. The banker's legendary attention to detail had been replaced by frantic activity, suggesting his careful plans were unraveling completely. A subtle signal from the tunnel entrance announced Master Chen's arrival with fresh intelligence. "Sullivan's men tried moving new equipment up the valley," he reported, "but miners block all trails, not with violence, just accidents. Wagons break down, bridges found damaged, rocks fall on the road. Very natural, very unfortunate." Tom nodded approvingly. The Chinese miners' subtle resistance techniques were proving remarkably effective. Without openly confronting Sullivan's forces, they were systematically limiting his options. Through carefully positioned observation ports, they watched Sullivan's reaction to mounting reports of failure. The banker's composed facade had cracked entirely, revealing the ruthless nature beneath. "Burn it," he ordered suddenly, surprising his lieutenants. "Burn everything. The documents, the claims office, all of it. If we can't control the records, no one can." This desperate command revealed how thoroughly their morning victory had shaken him. Sullivan's power had always rested on maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. ordering the destruction of official records, abandoned even the pretense of legal operation. "Sir," Hayes protested, "that's going too far. The territorial authorities—" "The territory?" Sullivan's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "You fool, we are the territorial authority. Every judge, every official, every bank. It's all part of our operation. Or it was until—" He broke off, visibly struggling to regain control. Through the tunnel system, Tom quickly dispatched messengers. Sullivan's outburst had confirmed suspicions about the scope of his corruption, information that needed to reach federal investigators immediately. "Mr. Blake," Leeway called softly from his telegraph position. "Strange messages coming through private bank lines. Other operations like Sullivan's, in Montana, in Nevada. They ask questions, very worried. Word of our resistance spreading." This was an unexpected but welcome development. Sullivan's operation wasn't unique. Similar corporate takeovers were happening throughout the Western Territories. Their success in resisting his methods was inspiring others to question previously. Unchallenged power, Rodriguez returned from coordinating with his teamsters, his expression troubled. "Sullivan's offering serious money now, trying to hire every gunman between here and Sacramento. Most are turning him down, but some—" "Let them come," Tom replied calmly. "Every hired gun he brings in just strengthens the federal case against him, and our network grows faster than he can recruit." Through his observation system, Tom watched Sullivan's increasingly erratic behavior. The banker's customary strategic thinking had been replaced by raw desperation, ordering the destruction of evidence, attempting to hire excessive force, abandoning legal pretenses, revealing the scope of his corruption, losing control of his professional crew, making threats that exposed his true nature. "Look at his hands," Kate said softly, studying her former employer through their mirrors. "He's not just angry anymore. He's afraid. I've never seen him afraid before." She was right. Sullivan's carefully manicured hands showed subtle tremors as he issued orders, a telling detail from a man whose self-control had once been legendary. A commotion from the direction of the bank caught their attention. Through the mirror network, they observed Whitmore's chief clerk emerging from the building, carrying stacks of documents. "He's turning evidence," Sarah realized. "The whole banking operation is falling apart." This development marked another crucial victory. Sullivan's power had always depended on maintaining multiple layers of legitimate business to conceal criminal activities. Now those layers were peeling away, exposing the corruption beneath. Through the afternoon, Tom's network continued gathering intelligence and strengthening positions. Each new development revealed more about their opponent's deterioration. Bank employees abandoning their posts, professional gunmen quietly disappearing, local officials distancing themselves, evidence appearing in unexpected places, communication networks breaking down. Supply lines increasingly disrupted, loyal supporters becoming scarce, but the quiet prospector knew better than to celebrate too early. Sullivan's growing desperation made him more dangerous, not less. The banker's next move would be dramatic, probably violent, an attempt to reassert control through pure force. "Miss Lucy!" Jimmy's urgent whisper drew their attention. The boy's face showed genuine alarm. "Sullivan's men are bringing in dynamite, lots of it, and they're not being careful with it at all." Through the observation system, they watched Sullivan's crew unload explosives from a wagon. The banker had apparently abandoned any pretense of mining operations. This was purely destructive material. "He's going to try to level the town," Tom concluded grimly. "If he can't control Trinity Falls, he'll destroy it, make an example to discourage resistance elsewhere." This shift to pure violence confirmed the completeness of their morning victory. Sullivan had been forced to abandon his carefully constructed facade of legitimate business, revealing the ruthless criminal beneath. As evening approached, Tom gathered his core allies for planning. Their success in defeating Sullivan's industrial takeover had pushed the banker to desperate measures. The next phase of conflict would be purely violent, the kind of brutal confrontation that had made Sullivan legendary in 3 territories. The quiet prospector had indeed won the first major victory, dismantling Sullivan's careful plans through coordinated resistance. But that victory had come at a cost, pushing their opponent toward the kind of vicious retaliation that had no concern for appearance or legality. As darkness settled over Trinity Falls, Tom Blackwood, or Hawkeye Blake, prepared his network for what was coming. They had demonstrated that organized resistance could defeat corporate power. Now they would need to show that justice could triumph over pure brutality. Spring sunshine bathed Trinity Falls in golden light as Tom Blackwood stood on the steps of the newly established Territorial Justice Office. 6 months had passed since Sullivan's dramatic downfall, and the town had transformed in ways few could have imagined. The quiet prospector's victory had sparked changes that rippled across 3 territories. "Morning, Mr. Blake," Sarah Chen called out, deliberately using his Pinkerton name. Since the truth about his identity had become public knowledge, the town had taken to using both names interchangeably, reflecting his dual nature as both prospector and lawman. "How's the newspaper coming along?" he asked, noting the fresh ink on her hands. The Chen family store had expanded to include Trinity Falls' first independent printing press, giving voice to local miners and merchants who had previously been silenced by corporate interests. "Just finished tomorrow's edition?" Sarah smiled. "Leading story is about the new mining cooperative, 30 independent operators working together, sharing equipment and resources. Sullivan would hate it." Tom allowed himself a slight smile at that. The bankers' attempt to monopolize the territory's resources had ironically led to unprecedented cooperation among independent miners. The cooperative system they developed during the resistance had evolved into a formal organization, proving more efficient than corporate control ever had. Through the morning, Tom made his rounds of the transformed town. Each stop showed how thoroughly things had changed. The former bank now housed a miners' credit union, owned and operated by the community. Hayes's old claim office had become headquarters for the territorial mining inspector. The hotel hosted regular meetings of the Independent Operators Association. The assay office displayed new regulations guaranteeing fair treatment for all miners. The Chinese quarter had expanded, its residents now fully integrated into town leadership. Kate Morrison emerged from the Justice Office carrying fresh telegrams. After Sullivan's arrest, she'd been appointed special investigator by the territorial governor, using her inside knowledge to help dismantle similar operations across the West. "More corporate takeover attempts are being stopped," she reported. 3 different territories using our resistance model. Seems you started something bigger than just stopping Sullivan." Tom nodded thoughtfully. Their victory had indeed sparked a movement. Communities throughout the West had learned that corporate power could be effectively resisted through organized cooperation and strategic thinking. Rodriguez's freight company had expanded into a network of independent operators, ensuring no single corporation could control transportation routes. The Teamsters' success inspired similar operations in other territories, creating resilient supply lines that corporate interests couldn't dominate. Master Chen appeared from his new mining engineering office, where he taught traditional Chinese techniques alongside modern methods. "More students will arrive next week," he reported. "Young miners want to learn old ways, combined with new thinking. Very good balance." This integration of different mining traditions was another positive change. The Chinese community's knowledge, once dismissed by corporate operators, was now recognized as valuable expertise. Their subtle resistance techniques had evolved into widely taught principles of sustainable resource management. Through his carefully maintained observation network, Tom noted other lasting changes. Independent miners patrolling their own claims, using techniques he'd taught. Merchants coordinating shipments to prevent price manipulation. Telegraph operators maintaining secure communication networks. Community leaders regularly sharing intelligence about corporate activities. Former resistance members training others in strategic thinking. Jimmy Chen, no longer quite so young, hurried up with fresh news. Federal marshals just arrested another corporate syndicate in Nevada, he reported eagerly. Used evidence from Sullivan's papers to track them down. The banker's detailed records had indeed proved invaluable. After his capture, investigators discovered documentation of similar operations throughout the West. Each new arrest further weakened the corrupt networks that had once seemed untouchable. "Mr. Blake," Pete Wilson's voice carried down the street. The old hard rock miner had become head of the new Claims Registration Board, ensuring fair treatment for independent operators. "Got something you need to see." In his office, Pete spread out a series of maps showing mining claims across 3 territories. "Notice anything interesting?" Tom studied the patterns with his trained investigator's eye. The distribution of independent claims had changed dramatically, forming cooperative networks that naturally resisted corporate takeover attempts. Communities had learned to position their operations strategically, maintaining crucial access routes and water rights through collective effort. "Sullivan's worst nightmare," Pete grinned. Independent miners working together, supporting each other instead of competing, makes it impossible for corporations to pick them off one by one. Through the afternoon, Tom received more visitors bringing news of positive changes. A Mexican vaquero cooperative controlling crucial transportation routes, buffalo hunters teaching, tracking skills to claim patrol groups, river pilots maintaining independent shipping networks, former resistance members serving as territorial deputies, Chinese merchants establishing trade networks beyond corporate control. Sarah returned with IE. The Finnish newspaper, its headlines reflecting the new era: mining cooperative expands operations, independent operators share new techniques, community banking system shows strong growth, corporate takeover attempt blocked by united response, the quiet prospectors. Methods had evolved into something lasting, a combination of strategic thinking, community cooperation, and practical resistance that corporate power couldn't easily overcome. Leeway appeared with fresh intelligence from his telegraph network, now expanded to cover 3 territories. "More communities asking for training," he reported. "Want to learn our methods? Build their own resistance networks." Tom's strategic approach to defeating Sullivan had indeed become a model for others. Communities throughout the West were learning that effective resistance required more than just force. It needed organization, intelligence, and cooperation. As evening approached, Tom made his way to his claim at Whiskey Creek. The site of his first confrontation with Sullivan's operation had been preserved as a kind of monument, reminding people that one determined individual, working with a united community, could stand against seemingly overwhelming power. The Pinkerton badge in his desk drawer served a similar purpose. He'd finally turned it in officially, but its legacy lived on in the strategic thinking he'd taught others. The quiet prospector and the skilled investigator had merged into something new, a prototype for a different kind of justice in the changing West. Through his original mirror network, now maintained as part of the town's early warning system, Tom observed the evening activity in Trinity Falls. The sight would have infuriated Sullivan. Independent operators moving freely, Chinese merchants conducting business openly, community leaders meeting to discuss common interests. Kate Morrison joined him for a final review of the day's developments. "You know what really destroyed Sullivan's power?" she asked thoughtfully. "Not just defeating his operation, but replacing it with something better, something that serves the whole community instead of just corporate interests. She was right. Their victory had gone beyond simply stopping a corrupt banker. They demonstrated a new model of community organization that naturally resisted corporate domination while promoting cooperative development. As night settled over Trinity Falls, Tom Blackwood, or Hawkeye Blake, reflected on how thoroughly things had changed. The quiet prospector's stand against corporate power had evolved into a movement that transformed the territory. The skills of the Pinkerton agent had been adapted into techniques any community could use to protect itself. This was his true legacy. Not just defeating one corrupt operation, but showing others how to prevent similar takeovers. The strategic thinking that had once served private justice now protected public interests throughout the West. Through the town, lights twinkled in homes and businesses owned by independent operators. The Chinese Quarter hummed with activity as merchants coordinated shipments through their expanding trade network. Former resistance members patrolled cooperatively held claims, maintaining the security their community had fought to establish. Tom touched the telegram in his pocket, another request for guidance from a distant community facing corporate pressure. The quiet prospector's methods would spread further, helping others protect their independence through strategic thinking and cooperative action. The sun set over Trinity Falls, painting the sky in colors that seemed to celebrate transformation. Tom Blackwood, or Hawkeye Blake, had found something he never expected, a way to serve justice that went beyond his Pinkerton past or his prospector's solitude. He had helped create a new model of community resistance that would endure long, after individual victories were forgotten. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.